What if the most terrifying acts of a king were never meant to be written, yet survived in whispers carved between the lines of ancient tablets? Imagine opening the chronicles of Ashurbanipal, the mighty Assyrian ruler celebrated for libraries, conquests, and imperial brilliance, only to discover shadows stretching far beyond the borders of what official history dared to record. This is where the story becomes unsettling, where power intertwines with cruelty, and where the man behind the crown reveals a side that even his scribes feared to immortalize. In the world of ancient empires, brutality was not unusual, but some rulers went beyond strategic violence and into realms that echo like warnings through time. Ashurbanipal was one of them. To understand the magnitude of his secret acts, you must first picture the Assyrian Empire at its height. A civilization forged through relentless warfare and a belief that fear was a tool of absolute control. Ashurbanipal inherited this legacy, but the chronicles suggest he elevated brutality into something personal. His victories were not merely military triumphs, they were spectacles of domination designed to send messages carved in flesh, bone, and terror. While historians often portray him as a scholar king who curated vast collections of knowledge, another story lurks beneath that polished narrative, a story of punishment so extreme that even enemies across the desert whispered his name with dread. This contrast creates a chilling tension. How could a man who preserved wisdom also engineer horrors that exceeded the violence of his predecessors? When you explore these hidden accounts, you start to feel the weight of a ruler who believed that cruelty was a language, and that every act of suffering was a sentence written for future generations to obey. The brutality was not random. It was systematic, deliberate, shaped with the same precision he applied to governing an empire. These were not ordinary acts of ancient violence. They were calculated demonstrations meant to break the will of entire nations before a single soldier stepped onto their soil. And yet, the deeper you look, the more the line between strategy and obsession begins to blur, revealing a king willing to cross boundaries that even his own warriors considered excessive. This is the world hidden behind Ashurbanipal's triumphal inscriptions, a world where fear was sculpted into something almost ceremonial. You might even wonder how many of these acts were intentionally erased from tablets, destroyed by those who believed no future empire should inherit such knowledge. The fragments that remain are enough to raise unsettling questions and to pull you deeper into the abyss of what was left unsaid. And as we begin uncovering the first of these disturbing acts, reflect for a moment on why certain stories survive only through silence. Has history protected us from the full truth, or merely postponed the moment we confront it? You have probably felt this tension before, that chilling sense of discovering something that was never meant to be revealed. If this resonates with you, share your thoughts. Leave a comment about how understanding the darker side of ancient power changes your view of history. Make sure to like this video and check if you are already subscribed so you do not miss what comes next, because the next revelations unfold directly from this shadow that surrounds Ashurbanipal, drawing you further into the secrets he tried to bury. As you move deeper into the shadowed corridors of Ashurbanipal's rule, the first disturbing layer reveals itself not through a single infamous act, but through a pattern of rituals designed to reshape the meaning of punishment. These were not merely disciplinary measures used to maintain order, they were deliberate spectacles of suffering crafted with almost ceremonial intensity. Within the Assyrian worldview, punishment was meant to broadcast power, yet under Ashurbanipal, it evolved into something more intricate, something that blurred the boundaries between intimidation and a chilling fascination with human endurance. Eyewitness accounts, fragmented inscriptions, and artistic depictions hint at methods that stretched far beyond what even other ancient empires dared to perform. Imagine prisoners brought before the king, their fate decided not simply as retribution, but as part of a staged demonstration meant to send ripples of terror across foreign lands. Pain became a medium through which Ashurbanipal communicated his authority, a language that spoke louder than treaties or armies. But what set his rituals apart was not just the brutality itself. It was the calculated structure behind each step, as though every punishment had a symbolic purpose intended to elevate his image above all rivals. The victims were transformed into living messages, warnings carved into the fabric of imperial memory. No tablet openly describes these acts yet. The echoes that survive in neighboring cultures portray a ruler whose imagination for cruelty exceeded what tradition required. Some rituals focused on prolonged displays of dominance, emphasizing the breaking of spirit rather than the ending of life. Soldiers were instructed to prepare specific instruments, not for efficiency, but for effect. These methods were designed to be witnessed, to linger in the minds of ambassadors, prisoners of war, and even Ashurbanipal's own commanders, ensuring that no one misunderstood the cost of defiance. Accounts suggest that his punishments often unfolded in stages, each one intensifying the psychological pressure on both the victim and the audience. This layering hints at a ruler who understood fear not only as a tool of governance, but as a psychological landscape he could shape at will. What is perhaps most unsettling is how seamlessly these rituals integrated into the political machinery of the empire. The suffering of individuals was choreographed to influence regional diplomacy, fuel propaganda, and reinforce the divine image of the king. In this context, cruelty was not an aberration, but a calculated expression of statecraft. It became a bridge between Ashurbanipal's public persona as a scholar king and the darker manifestation of his unchecked authority. The contrast between these two faces creates an eerie dissonance, as though the studies he cherished in his great library merely sharpened his ability to manipulate the past fears and vulnerabilities of those under his rule. As you trace these patterns, you begin to sense how the rituals laid the foundation for even more extreme acts that remained hidden behind palace doors. The psychological effect of these punishments spread through the empire like an invisible force, shaping behaviors, alliances, and rebellions before they even took form. And yet, this is only the beginning, a precursor to the secret chambers where Ashurbanipal pushed cruelty into new domains that chroniclers hesitated to even imply, leaving behind a silence heavy enough to suggest horrors that surpassed what the empire was willing to acknowledge. Moving past the public rituals that reinforced Ashurbanipal's authority, you enter a far more unsettling dimension of his rule, one shielded from ordinary eyes and reserved for those unfortunate enough to be chosen as instruments of a deeper message. While the grand plazas displayed punishments meant for political spectators, the king maintained a private chamber within the palace where cruelty evolved into an intimate expression of dominance. This concealed space, suggested by faint descriptions in hostile chronicles and scattered archaeological hints, functioned not as a simple prison, but as a theatre designed for psychological disintegration. Here, Ashurbanipal transformed individuals into symbols, bending their suffering into narratives that served his personal sense of control. The purpose of this chamber was not swift execution. Instead, it served as a place where the king could observe the breaking of someone's will in real time, a process treated almost like an art. This was where enemies of status, rebellious generals, captured nobles, and even traitors within his own ranks were brought when their fall needed to be more than a statement. Their suffering had to become a memory that lived long after their bodies failed. The chamber's design appears to have been deliberate, structured to reinforce helplessness through darkness, isolation, and the constant awareness of the king's presence. In this place, cruelty was not an instrument of immediate fear, but of slow erosion, piece by piece dismantling the identity of the victim. What emerges from these accounts is a sense that Ashurbanipal sought not only obedience, but submission of a deeper kind. The chamber functioned as a crucible where psychological torment intertwined with physical degradation, and where the king could observe how long a human being could cling to defiance before collapsing. Those allowed to survive these encounters did not return as soldiers or servants. They returned as warnings, shaped into living testimonies of the king's reach. Their mutilations, disfigurements, or mental fragmentation served as silent statements stronger than any inscription. They embodied the consequences of challenging him, carrying their trauma into the public sphere where its effect rippled across the empire. Yet even more haunting are the implications of what remains unrecorded. If the surviving fragments paint only the edges of these practices, then what took place in the heart of the chamber may have been far more disturbing. Some hostile accounts hint that Ashurbanipal experimented with methods meant to explore the limits of endurance, sometimes modifying traditional punishments to prolong suffering or intensify the psychological burden. These were not actions motivated solely by political necessity. They suggest a deeper drive, one that blurred the boundary between strategic cruelty and personal fascination with the breaking of human spirit. As you consider the existence of this chamber, the image of Ashurbanipal shifts again. He becomes less the distant ruler commanding from a throne, and more the architect of fear, working behind closed doors, shaping cruelty in ways that left no official record, but persisted in whispered recollections among the conquered. The secrecy surrounding this room contributes to the aura of dread that accompanied the king's name, extending beyond the battlefield and into the intimate spaces of palace intrigue. And from within these walls, a darker evolution of his methods begins to emerge, preparing the ground for acts that stretch the capabilities of an empire built on dominance and fear, hinting at an escalation that only the next revelations can fully expose. As you follow the progression of Ashurbanipal's hidden practices, a darker strategy begins to surface, one that operated far beyond the confines of his private chamber. While the punishments within the palace targeted individuals, the king engineered another method designed to fracture the resolve of entire nations before his armies ever arrived. This approach did not rely solely on spectacle or physical suffering. It was a psychological campaign that manipulated the fear embedded in neighboring kingdoms. Through carefully orchestrated displays and calculated dissemination of stories, Ashurbanipal transformed cruelty into a form of preemptive warfare, ensuring that resistance collapsed long before any battle could be fought. At the heart of this method was the creation of symbolic victims whose fate echoed across borders. These individuals were chosen not because of their personal threat, but because their suffering could represent an entire people. Captured nobles, diplomats, or regional leaders became instruments in a narrative designed to magnify terror. Instead of executing them swiftly, Ashurbanipal used them as conduits, sending back survivors who carried the memory of degradation etched into their minds and bodies. Their return served as a message stronger than any envoy could deliver, a living prophecy of what awaited those who dared oppose Assyrian rule. But the brilliance of this strategy lay not only in what was done to the victims, but in how their stories were allowed to spread. Rumors were encouraged, distortions carefully tolerated, and horrifying embellishments quietly permitted to circulate. The goal was to let fear grow organically, fueled by imagination and desperation. Kingdoms facing the possibility of Assyrian conquest found themselves haunted by visions of their own fate, shaped not by direct confrontation, but by the accounts of those who had barely escaped the king's grasp. This psychological erosion often weakened alliances, disrupted military planning, and seeded doubts among leaders who feared that resisting Ashurbanipal might provoke a destruction beyond anything they were prepared to endure. The more these stories traveled, the more they solidified the king's reputation as a ruler who wielded fear with the precision of a weapon. His armies marched with the advantage of an unseen force already working ahead of them, softening targets, breaking unity, and ensuring that the weight of Assyrian power felt heavier than any army size could explain. This manipulation of perception allowed Ashurbanipal to maintain dominance with fewer actual confrontations, preserving resources while expanding his influence. What appeared on the surface as exaggerated legend was in truth a deliberate construction, crafted to hollow out the resolve of enemies before a single sword was drawn. Yet this strategy also opened the path to even more disturbing practices, as the king increasingly relied on psychological domination to shape the geopolitical landscape. Each victory reinforced his belief that fear could be engineered with the same efficiency as a military campaign. This growing confidence encouraged him to experiment further, blurring the lines between intimidation and cruelty, and setting the stage for acts that reached deeper into the human psyche than traditional warfare ever could. And as these methods intensified, they fed into a far greater system of control that extended not just across borders, but into the very identity of those who found themselves under Assyrian shadow. If something in this reveals a new perspective for you, share your thoughts in the comments about how fear shaped ancient power and how these strategies reflect the darker side of imperial dominance. The deeper you explore Ashurbanipal's expanding system of control, the clearer it becomes that his power was not confined to physical dominance. What truly distinguished his reign was his mastery of psychological warfare, a force that seeped into foreign courts long before Assyrian soldiers appeared on the horizon. Unlike the overt brutality of earlier emperors, Ashurbanipal cultivated fear as an invisible weapon, shaping the expectations and anxieties of distant rulers who had never seen his face. This strategy relied not simply on cruelty, but on the idea of cruelty, the anticipation of horrors that may or may not have been fully real. In this realm of uncertainty, imagination became one of the king's most effective tools. It began with carefully curated stories of his punishments and rituals, which were allowed to drift into neighboring territories through traders, escaped prisoners, and diplomatic envoys. The details of these accounts often varied, sometimes becoming more frightening with each retelling. Yet this inconsistency only strengthened their effect. When a rumor lacks clear boundaries, it expands to fill the fears of those who hear it. Kingdoms far from Assyrian borders began preparing for invasions that had not yet been planned, shifting resources, fortifying cities, and reshaping alliances in anticipation of a threat that existed as much in their minds as on the battlefield. Ashurbanipal understood this dynamic, and he exploited it with a precision that altered the political balance of the Near East. The brilliance of his strategy lay in how little direct effort it required. Unlike physical campaigns that demanded soldiers, supplies, and long marches, psychological terror moved on its own, carried by the insecurities of those who feared becoming the next target. Some rulers responded by offering tribute, not because they had been defeated, but because they dreaded the possibility of facing a king whose cruelty had become legendary. Others entered alliances out of desperation, hoping that unity might shield them from an emperor whose shadow seemed to stretch farther than his armies. Even those who possessed strong fortifications found themselves questioning whether resistance could withstand a ruler rumored to take pleasure in breaking the human spirit. This atmosphere of dread, often generated instability that worked in Ashurbanipal's favor. Rivalries between smaller kingdoms intensified as leaders sought to prove they were not the weakest link, and internal conflicts erupted when political factions argued over how to respond to the looming danger. The king's influence reached across borders not through messengers or soldiers, but through fear that undermined diplomatic cohesion and weakened collective resistance. Nations that might have stood firm together found themselves divided by anxiety, making Assyrian expansion easier and less costly. What is most intriguing is how seamlessly this psychological strategy complemented the visible brutality of his reign. The public punishments provided the raw material for the rumors, while the private acts fueled speculation about what remained unseen. This duality created a powerful illusion, the sense that Ashurbanipal's cruelty had no limits, that even the most unimaginable stories might contain a fragment of truth. It was within this uncertainty that his influence thrived, allowing him to shape the geopolitical landscape without drawing a single sword. And as his confidence in this method grew, he began pushing further, exploring new ways to reinforce terror not only through stories, but through objects, rituals, and displays meant to linger in the minds of those who witnessed them. These elements formed the next layer of his power, revealing how deeply he understood the human need to avoid suffering at any cost. As Ashurbanipal's influence expanded, the visible face of his authority grew increasingly intertwined with the spectacle of death. Unlike the intimate tortures carried out in his private chamber or the psychological campaigns that rippled across foreign kingdoms, the executions he orchestrated in public spaces served a different purpose. These were not merely punishments, nor were they chaotic eruptions of violence meant to overwhelm witnesses. They were meticulously structured displays, crafted with the same precision as grand processions or royal ceremonies. In these moments, cruelty was elevated into a public ritual, a demonstration of a ruler who believed that power must not only be held, but performed. The sites chosen for these executions were often highly symbolic. City gates, palace plazas, temple courtyards, and border checkpoints became stages upon which the empire's authority was carved into memory. Victims were selected according to political significance. Rebellious nobles who questioned the king's supremacy, captured officers who refused to surrender, envoys who represented defiant kingdoms, or traitors whose downfall served as a warning to others. Their deaths were choreographed to reinforce the idea that Ashurbanipal governed with divine sanction, and that resisting him meant challenging forces beyond human control. The methods used were designed not simply to end life, but to send layered messages. Accounts describe impalements arranged in precise formations, bodies displayed in patterns meant to be seen from great distances, and orchestrations where the suffering of one individual framed the fate of others awaiting judgment. Soldiers who carried out the executions were instructed to maintain order and spectacle simultaneously, ensuring that the display was not interpreted as an emotional frenzy, but as an extension of royal will. The victims became symbols, transformed into physical embodiments of warnings, each one contributing to an atmosphere where defiance appeared both futile and fatal. These public deaths often coincided with major military campaigns or political shifts. When Ashurbanipal wanted to reinforce his dominance over a newly subdued territory, an execution might be staged at the city entrance, ensuring that every inhabitant understood the cost of rebellion. When diplomatic pressure was needed, the death of an opposing envoy could be arranged so that returning survivors carried not only the message, but the vivid memory of what awaited those who opposed Assyrian rule. And when internal threats arose, the king used these displays to extinguish dissent before it could gain momentum. ensuring the loyalty of commanders, governors, and priests who witnessed the consequences of disobedience firsthand. Yet the most chilling aspect of these executions was their intent to endure. The bodies were often left exposed, suspended, or arranged in ways that prolonged visibility, allowing travelers, merchants, and foreigners to absorb the message long after the act itself had ended. Stories of these displays became part of regional folklore, exaggerating details while preserving the core truth that Ashurbanipal ruled through a mastery of fear that transcended the immediacy of violence. His authority permeated daily life, lingering in the background of markets, ceremonies, and military assemblies, shaping how people spoke, acted, and even thought in his presence or under his dominion. This use of execution as a ritualized expression of power reveals yet another layer of the king's complex relationship with cruelty. It was not enough for him to punish. He sought to imprint the memory of punishment onto the collective consciousness of the empire. The more these displays intensified, the more they prepared the ground for measures even more extreme, forms of brutality not intended for the eyes of the many, but for the controlled. Spaces and secret archives of the king's most private dominion. And it is within this transition from public spectacle to hidden experimentation that the next stage of Ashurbanipal's disturbing practices begins to emerge. As Ashurbanipal's reign progressed, the boundary between calculated state cruelty and personal fascination with suffering began to blur in unsettling ways. Beyond the public executions and psychological campaigns that shaped his image, there existed another realm of brutality hidden from official documentation. These were acts whispered about by foreign scribes and hinted at in rival chronicles, the kinds of stories that persisted precisely because they were never meant to be acknowledged. They describe experiments carried out on captives whose identities were erased, individuals selected not for political symbolism, but for the opportunity they offered the king to test the limits of human endurance. In this shadowed sphere, cruelty was no longer a tool of governance, but a private pursuit driven by curiosity, control, and the desire to push boundaries that even the Assyrian elite considered forbidden. The victims of these experiments came from a wide range of backgrounds: warriors captured on distant battlefields, envoys whose kingdoms had fallen out of favor, and individuals accused of espionage or treachery. Once taken into the depths of the palace, they effectively vanished from history, their names omitted from tablets and their fates reduced to faint rumors. Accounts suggest that Ashurbanipal oversaw or commissioned procedures designed to observe the body under extreme stress, using pain, deprivation, or manipulation of the senses to study how quickly defiance could be replaced with submission. These were not chaotic acts, but structured trials, monitored by select officials who were sworn to silence or eliminated after their purpose was fulfilled. What makes these stories particularly disturbing is the implication that the king sought knowledge from these experiments, as though understanding the breaking point of the human spirit could grant him a deeper power over his subjects. Some chronicles hint at the use of narcotics, poisons, or environmental extremes to create controlled conditions, enabling Ashurbanipal to observe reactions with the same attention he applied to intellectual pursuits in his library. This merging of scholarship and cruelty stands in stark contrast to the image of the cultured monarch often presented in mainstream history. It reveals a ruler who believed that dominance required mastery not only of armies and territories, but of the internal mechanisms of fear and suffering. The secrecy surrounding these experiments intensified their impact on those who speculated about them. Because nothing was recorded officially, the imagination of contemporaries filled the void, generating tales more frightening than any preserved inscription. These unverified accounts, though impossible to confirm, played an important role in shaping the aura around Ashurbanipal. They suggested that there were depths to his cruelty still unknown, layers of brutality that exceeded the already terrible punishments enacted publicly. The very absence of concrete records became a form of power, as the uncertainty surrounding these rumored acts magnified the king's mystique and fed into the terror that defined his empire. As you follow this thread deeper into the shadows of his reign, the evolution of Ashurbanipal becomes increasingly clear. He transformed cruelty into a multifaceted instrument capable of shaping politics, identity, and even the boundaries of human experience. And yet, these experiments represent only one dimension of a darker world hidden within the palace, a world where objects, artifacts, and preserved remnants of suffering served purposes more disturbing still. It is in these private collections and macabre displays that the next layer of his rule begins to reveal itself, hinting at obsessions that extended beyond the body and into symbols meant to preserve fear for generations. If this exploration sparks a reaction in you, leave a comment sharing how these hidden experiments reshape your understanding of ancient power and the unseen depths behind historical narratives. As you move deeper into the concealed layers of Ashurbanipal's rule, the focus shifts from the suffering he inflicted on living bodies to the disturbing artifacts he collected and preserved as symbols of his authority. These objects, never mentioned in official records yet referenced in hostile chronicles and archaeological speculation, paint an unsettling picture of a king who treated cruelty not merely as a tool, but as a source of inspiration. His private chambers were said to contain items that blurred the line between trophy and warning, objects crafted or taken from victims whose fates served purposes far beyond their execution. Within these hidden rooms, brutality became tangible, transformed into relics meant to reinforce the king's sense of dominion long after the screams had faded. The existence of such artifacts suggests a ruler who understood the psychological weight that physical objects could carry. Some accounts describe preserved body parts treated to resist decay, arranged in patterns that reflected royal triumphs or the downfall of significant enemies. Others mention sculpted effigies made from the remains of vanquished leaders, modeled in ways that distorted their identity into grotesque caricatures. Whether these tales were exaggerated or based on fragments of truth, they share a common theme. Ashurbanipal sought to materialize his victories, creating macabre reminders that served both as personal validation and instruments of fear. These objects were not displayed publicly. They were reserved for select audiences whose loyalty or terror was essential. Foreign emissaries rumored to have seen them described chambers lined with trophies that communicated the consequences of defiance more clearly than any diplomatic threat. Governors recalled visits where a single preserved artifact positioned beside the throne replaced an entire speech about obedience. By exposing these chosen individuals to such horrifying objects, the king ensured that the stories would spread through their courts, amplifying his reputation without requiring widespread exposure. The secrecy enhanced their effect, creating an aura of forbidden knowledge around the king's private domain. The craftsmanship applied to these artifacts suggests involvement from palace artisans who operated under strict supervision. They were instructed to produce items that were not merely shocking, but symbolically meaningful. Some objects incorporated inscriptions that twisted traditional Assyrian victory motifs into darker representations, merging artistic convention with the sinister impulses of the king. Others took familiar religious symbols and infused them with messages of domination, reinforcing Ashurbanipal's belief that his rule was divinely sanctioned. These artifacts became a fusion of politics, ritual, and terror, extending the reach of his cruelty into realms where words or punishments alone could not suffice. What is most haunting is the role these objects played in shaping Ashurbanipal's psychological landscape. They allowed him to revisit his conquests intimately, to hold visual and physical evidence of his dominance. Whenever doubt or challenge arose, the objects reinforced his self-image as a ruler whose authority transcended life itself, capable of transforming the slain into permanent extensions of his will. This dynamic hints at an obsession not merely with victory, but with possession, as though controlling a fragment of an enemy granted him mastery over their entire legacy. These macabre items also contributed to the atmosphere within the palace. Servants, guards, and advisors who lived in proximity to these hidden chambers were inevitably affected, whether by fear of discovery or by the tension of serving a king whose private world was saturated with symbols of violence. This internal climate, shaped by secrets and apprehension, influenced the functioning of the empire's political core. Decisions made in such an environment carried the imprint of unease, reinforcing Ashurbanipal's grip on those closest to him. And as these chambers filled with more objects, his fascination with preserving the physical remnants of his rule evolved into something even more consequential. A mindset that would shape the final and most enduring legacy of his brutal reign. As the shadows of Ashurbanipal's reign stretched beyond his lifetime, the influence of his methods seeped into the political and military fabric of the empire. His actions were not isolated bursts of brutality, but carefully structured demonstrations of how fear could be transformed into a system of governance. This system did not end with him. Instead, it became a silent curriculum absorbed by generals, governors, priests, and future kings who witnessed or heard about the depths of his cruelty. The consequences of these lessons echoed through generations, shaping the policies and identity of a civilization that had already been built on the foundations of conquest. Although Ashurbanipal's successors rarely matched the full scope of his experimentation, many adopted aspects of his approach to maintain authority. They inherited the understanding that psychological domination could be more effective than military force, and that public displays of punishment served as instruments of political stability, even as specific rituals faded or were replaced by new forms of control. The underlying philosophy remained: cruelty had strategic value. This mindset influenced how rebellions were handled, how conquered territories were integrated, and how borders were defended. The empire, though evolving, carried within it the imprint of the king, whose reign had refined violence into a sophisticated mechanism for shaping human behavior. In administrative centers, officials trained under Ashurbanipal or influenced by his policies taught emerging leaders that fear was a currency as potent as gold. They emphasized the power of symbols, the importance of maintaining the appearance of absolute authority, and the necessity of suppressing dissent swiftly. These teachings were conveyed not through official proclamations, but through examples, anecdotes, and memories shared among those who had lived under his rule. Over time, they crystallized into an unspoken doctrine that guided the functioning of power, shaping everything from the language used in royal decrees to the expectations placed upon soldiers at the empire's frontiers. What makes this transmission particularly noteworthy is how seamlessly it blended with Assyrian tradition. The empire had always valued strength, but Ashurbanipal added complexity to that value by introducing layers of psychological manipulation and symbolic coercion. His successors, even if uncomfortable with his extremities, could not ignore the effectiveness of his methods. They saw how rebellions faltered under the weight of fear, how regions remained docile long after a single execution, and how alliances shifted simply because of stories circulating about his cruelty. These outcomes reinforce the notion that his practices had strategic merit, embedding them into the empire's long-term identity. Yet this inheritance carried risks. The more rulers depended on terror, the more fragile their authority became. They relied on fear rather than loyalty, intimidation rather than shared purpose. This produced a political culture in which trust was scarce and dissent was driven underground. Generals who enforced the harshest measures gained prominence, while those who favored diplomacy struggled to be heard. The empire's internal dynamics grew increasingly tense, shaped by the belief that cruelty was essential to stability. In this way, Ashurbanipal's legacy persisted not only through admiration, but also through the shadows of consequences his successors could not escape. As these practices spread across generations, they transformed from personal strategies into structural elements of imperial rule. This shift ensured that the Assyrian Empire carried the imprint of his worldview long after his death, influencing decisions, shaping policies, and defining what it meant to wield power. And yet, this legacy paved the way for a culmination of these forces, leading toward a final assessment of how the king's brutal innovations altered the ancient world. The closing layers of his story reveal the magnitude of his impact, showing how cruelty became both his greatest weapon and the shadow that haunted the empires that followed. As you reach the final layer of Ashurbanipal's unsettling legacy, the full weight of his influence becomes strikingly clear. His reign was not merely a sequence of brutal events, but a transformation of how power operated in the ancient world. He re-engineered cruelty into a multidimensional system, blending psychological manipulation, symbolic terror, ritualized punishment, and private experimentation into a model that reshaped the mechanics of imperial rule. The repercussions of this system did not end with the Assyrian Empire's decline. They reverberated through the political structures of later civilizations that studied or feared the techniques he perfected. His shadow extended far beyond his lifetime, becoming a reference point for rulers who saw in his methods both a blueprint for dominance and a warning of its eventual cost. The ancient world remembered Ashurbanipal as a paradox, a king whose scholarly pursuits coexisted with an almost obsessive commitment to the performance of fear. His library preserved knowledge, his actions preserved terror. These two legacies, so different in purpose and tone, created a complex historical figure whose influence touched both the intellectual and the violent dimensions of imperial identity. Civilizations that rose after the Assyrians often encountered his memory indirectly through clay tablets, inscriptions, or whispered chronicles that described a ruler whose cruelty reached depths rarely documented with clarity. It is this ambiguity, this mixture of record and rumor, that allowed his story to survive across millennia and continue, shaping how empires understood the psychology of control. Over generations, the stories surrounding him became part of the cultural imagination of the Near East. They influenced how resistance movements interpreted the behavior of invading armies, how scribes described the dangers of unchecked authority, and how leaders justified harsh measures by invoking the specter of a king who had mastered the art of fear. His reign demonstrated that cruelty could become a political language, one that transcended borders and eras. Even when his empire fell, echoes of his methodology resurfaced in the systems of later rulers who believed that maintaining dominion required the careful orchestration of intimidation. In this way, Ashurbanipal became not just a figure of history, but a symbol of what happens when power is guided by obsession rather than necessity. Yet the true magnitude of his impact lies not only in the empires that followed, but in the questions his story forces us to confront. It compels us to examine how far a ruler can go before cruelty becomes self-destructive, how fear can stabilize an empire in the short term while corroding its foundations over time, and how the pursuit of dominance can transform into an addiction that reshapes identity itself. These questions persist because the methods he employed remain disturbingly relevant in the study of power dynamics. His legacy warns that the most dangerous leaders are often those who understand that control is not achieved solely through force, but through the manipulation of perception, memory, and fear. And as this exploration reaches its final breath, you may feel the lingering tension of a story that refuses to rest, a story built from fragments of truth and echoes of horror. If this journey through the darker corridors of ancient power resonated with you, feel free to leave a comment saying the phrase, "I am with you," until the end. It helps deepen the discussion and shows how these forgotten histories still shape the way we interpret authority. If the content offered insight or stirred reflection, a simple like supports the creation of more narratives like this. And if you found value in following these hidden layers of the past, consider subscribing so you can continue exploring the forces that shaped civilizations. There is a video here waiting that expands on these themes and carries you into the next chapter of this long and shadowed world, ready whenever you choose to take the next step.